Today, I want to talk to you about some of the biggest ideas that have come recently into philosophy. I'm going to talk about 4 different areas of philosophy: the mind, ethics, metaphysics, and philosophy of science. And in each area, I'm going to pick out the biggest idea that I think has come in over the last few years, maybe the biggest idea so far in the 21st century. Now, of course, any list of the biggest ideas is going to be controversial. You might have different ideas about what the big ideas are. If you do, stick your ideas down in the comments. I'm going to try and cover all of these 4 ideas in one video, so I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail on each of them, but if you would like more detail in a follow-up, leave me a comment down below. Okay, so let's jump straight in with philosophy of mind. Now, I think the biggest idea in philosophy of mind in the 21st century so far is panpsychism. Panpsychism is the idea, very roughly, that everything is conscious, or that there is consciousness everywhere. That's literally what the term means. In contemporary philosophy, that idea has been kind of modified and refined a little bit to make it a little bit more scientific. Let's talk about that. But first of all, where does this idea come from? Well, it's not a new idea in the sense that somebody thought up this century. Panpsychism goes right back. It's got ancient roots in Hinduism, for example. Some of the Greeks kind of were big on panpsychism, the idea that there was a mind in all things, not just living things, but all things. But to a certain extent, in contemporary philosophy, which kind of focuses on the mind either through Descartes' idea of dualism or through more materialistic, physicalist accounts of the mind, where maybe the mind is just identical to or heavily dependent on the physical brain, ideas like panpsychism didn't get much of a look in. And it's only really in the last 10 years or so that people have started taking panpsychism seriously within contemporary analytic philosophy of mind. So there are loads of different varieties of panpsychism out there. I'm just going to tell you about the one that I think is the most plausible. So you could have a variety of panpsychism where everything has the same kind of consciousness, or the whole universe is conscious, or whatever. I don't really see much sense for going for those. Here's the kind of panpsychism that I think's the most plausible. So we're going to start by thinking about fundamental particles, the particles of the standard model of physics, and we're going to say on this model of panpsychism that each of those has a very, very basic kind of consciousness. There is in some sense, what it's like to be an electron. It might be very, very, very simple, a very basic form of consciousness. Maybe we don't even want to call it consciousness. Maybe we call it proto-consciousness or whatever, okay? But there is something there, something it's like to be an electron, to be a quark. And by combining these kind of basic consciousnesses together, we get up to bigger, more complex forms of consciousness. So if you put those particles together in the way they come together in a human brain, you're going to get a human kind of consciousness. Now, exactly how that goes, how that story of combination is meant to go, is kind of the problem for panpsychism. It's called the combination problem. How do you put together these very basic forms of consciousness to get a full-blown human type, what it's like to be me, what it's like to be you? Okay, panpsychists, I guess they're working on solving that problem. This form of panpsychism, that it's the fundamental physical particles that each have this basic conscious experience, that's a theory that is related to Russellian monism after Bertrand Russell. So this is a theory of mind and of reality that he came up with in his 1927 analysis of matter book. And I think it's a really nice idea. It starts from this premise that science can tell us only so much about the fundamental particles. It can tell us how they behave, what they do, but not the full story about what they are. There is this kind of gap in the science as to what these fundamental particles intrinsically are. And that gap, according to Russell, is filled with consciousness, or the basic properties of consciousness that the fundamental particles have. That is their intrinsic nature. And it's meant to explain both their behaviour, that is the kind of stuff that science investigates, and our experiential properties, what it's like to be a human. Now, Russell's view came out in 1927. He kind of changed his view over the rest of his life, and not many people took this view seriously. Throughout the 20th century, people were dualists or behaviourists or identity theorists, physicalists, functionalists, and it wasn't until pretty recently, the last 10 years or so, that people started taking panpsychism and Russellian monism seriously. So there was a little bit of this back at the end of the 20th century. So Tom Nagel, in his 1979, I think, book Mortal Questions, has a paper on panpsychism where he's basically arguing physicalism just isn't going to work, dualism is dead and buried, panpsychism is the way out of the problem. Similarly, Galen Strawson, he's the son of the famous 20th century philosopher Peter Strawson. He has a 2006, I think, paper on panpsychism. He calls it realistic monism because he thinks that physicalism is a kind of unrealistic form of monism. Basically, his argument is, look, there's just no way from all this physical stuff you're going to magically get the mind emerging. Kind of emergence like that just doesn't happen. If you've got the physical stuff and the mind can't emerge from it, but the mind really is real, where does it come from? It has to be in some way embedded in the physical stuff. There has to be conscious properties, even in the most basic physical particles. That's basically his argument for panpsychism. You also get some ideas of panpsychism in David Chalmers' 1996 book, The Conscious Mind. This is a great book. Everyone interested in thinking philosophically about the mind should read it. Chalmers isn't a panpsychist, but he does think it's a theory that's worth considering. And then Philip Goff more recently has a couple of books about panpsychism. One's called Consciousness and Fundamental Reality, and more recently he's got this book called Why, in which he ties together these ideas about consciousness and reality to the idea of purpose. And, this is slightly more out there, wacky stuff, but, philosophy, in order to get really good, interesting philosophy, we need both big ideas and careful reasoning about them. Okay, those big ideas are really important, and I think panpsychism, whatever you think about it, it is one of the big ideas, and adding it to the kind of stock of here are the theories that we're taking seriously in discussing in philosophy of mind, I think that's just going to push things forward. So, me personally, I'm not saying I believe in panpsychism, but I do think increasingly it's a theory that's worth taking seriously. Okay, let's move on from the mind and think about ethics. I think one of the biggest new ideas that's come into philosophical ethics is long-termism. So this is the idea that when we're engaging in ethical decision-making, thinking about what we should do, some or nearly all or all of the time, we should be thinking about the far future, thousands of years or maybe even millions of years for now, thinking about what is good for the human race in that very far future. So this is an idea that's relevant to applied ethics, okay? When we are making practical decisions in the world, whether as individuals or as organizations or as governments, which kind of issues should we be thinking about and where should we put our resources, whether that is our time, our money, or whatever. So let's think about it like this. Suppose you are responsible for the government's spending on research, okay? You've got a bunch of money. Where are you going to spend that to kind of make things go better for the human race? You could spend it on alleviating homelessness, you could spend it on relieving third world debt, you could spend it on mitigating the worst effects of climate change over the next century, or you could look at research programs that deal with more kind of out there things like, the risk of meteor strikes wiping out the human race, or dealing with existential threat from AI, AI kind of going bad and wiping out all the humans, or more positively, expanding human settlements from Earth into the rest of the galaxy. Or whatever, okay? So more kind of out there stuff. And you might think, well, we've got some serious problems like, world hunger and global warming. Why should we think about those kind of more out there things? But long-termism suggests that we should think about things in a slightly different way. It basically says, which of these options is going to benefit humans the most? Not just humans who exist now, but humans in total, okay? Thinking about all the humans now, in the future, all the humans there ever will be. what is going to be the most benefit to them. Now, of course, we don't know how many humans there's going to be. We don't know how big the human population is going to get, and we don't know how long it's going to last for. But we can estimate. So all of this is based on estimates. And, these estimates vary wildly. It very much depends on, are we going to wipe ourselves out soon? Is global warming going to wipe us out? Is AI threat going to wipe us out? Are we going to expand beyond the Earth? Are we going to start living on other planets? But a lot of these estimates seem to be in the ballpark of the human race will continue for, let's say, another 1,000,000 years. And the population will probably maybe get a bit bigger or maybe get a lot bigger. Depends whether we stay just on Earth and then maybe it'll settle down at like around 10 billion, or are we going to start expanding into space, in which case it could get a lot bigger. But even just looking at fairly conservative numbers, the total number of humans who will ever exist in the future could be really, really huge. So they're estimating numbers like 10 to the 18. That's a quintillion, 1,000,000 trillion human beings who will ever live. That's a kind of conservative estimate. It might even get as big as 10 to the 24 future humans. That's a 1 followed by 24 zeros. That is an incredibly large number. That is an incredibly large population of future humans. And of course, if the human race will survive for another 1,000,000 years, most of those are going to live in the far future, over 1,000 years from now. So thinking about how can we benefit most of those humans, we can't just think about the next 10 years, the next 100 years, the next 1,000 years. We're kind of thinking in terms of what are we going to do for the next 1,000,000 years. This is a huge, huge idea, and it has some really serious implications, both for how we think about our own ethical lives and also for thinking about kind of what sort of policies organizations and governments should enact. So I think in some ways there's some good implications here. Like, don't just do short-term thinking. Don't just kind of make your corporation valuable for the next couple of years, but think about what's going to be good for the future. Don't just do stuff in government that's going to get you elected for the next term, but think about what's going to benefit humans way into the future. Okay, so that might be a positive reason for putting loads and loads of money into carbon reduction, mitigating the worst effects of climate change. However, I think there's going to be some pretty negative implications of this as well. So, for instance, some of the people who are going to get affected worse by the effects of climate change are those people, Pacific Islanders, whose homes are basically going to get swamped by rising sea levels. But long-termism seems to suggest that, there's not so many of those people, so we should just not worry about them. Probably there's going to be way, way, way more people in the future who live in places that are habitable, because people will move from uninhabitable to habitable places, so kind of maybe we shouldn't worry about that sort of stuff. That seems like a really worrying consequence of this kind of long-term attitude. Long-termism is a pretty recent idea in philosophy. It kind of grew out of the effective altruism movement, kind of centered around philosophers in Oxford. The idea that, for instance, if you're going to donate money to charity, you should donate it to the most effective causes, like buying malaria nets or whatever, okay? Give your money to the place that is going to have the most benefit for the most number of people. And you kind of extrapolate those ideas and then kind of go, well, don't just talk about people who exist now, but think about all people in the future, and you kind of go from effective altruism to long-termism. A lot of these ideas really came together in a working paper by the Oxford philosophers Hilary Greaves and William MacAskill in 2019, and then all of this gets expressed and defended in a lot more detail in Will MacAskill's book, What We Owe the Future. This is a really accessible book, so if you're interested in these kind of issues, I think that's a really good place to start. And I just want to flag that a lot of philosophers, a lot of ethicists find long-termism a really worrying kind of ethical view because of the consequences it has. It seems to say that there are people that we can now see kind of really suffering, but we shouldn't worry about them too much, provided that there's going to be loads of people in the future who we can improve their lives through the stuff that we do now. So a lot of the arguments in favour of long-termism, they're based on probability, they're based on predictions, probabilistic predictions of future numbers of humans. And a lot of people think those predictions are worrying. But the thing is that the maths looks good. We're kind of just taking probability theory the way we would use it in science and applying it to ethics. A lot of ethicists seem not to like that, but that doesn't sound like a good objection to me. I mean, after all, if it's good for science, why wouldn't it be good for ethics. Nevertheless, I do feel like a lot of the ideas associated with long-termism, some of its predictions, some of its inferences seem to be really, really troubling. So basically, we just need to scrutinize these ideas really carefully to see whether it really is a viable ethics. Okay, let's move on to our third topic. We're going to talk about metaphysics. What is the biggest idea in metaphysics so far this century? Well, there's a whole bunch, but I think the concept that has made the most difference to metaphysics recently is grounding. Okay, so maybe that's a controversial choice, but put it like this. If you look at papers from the end of the 20th century, papers from Kripke, Lewis, whatever, you don't really see this concept of grounding coming up at all. You open a random metaphysics paper now from the last, say, 5 years, chances are it's going to have grounding all over it. And not just in metaphysics, you talk about philosophy of mind, philosophy of science, even ethics, all the topics we're talking about today, the concept of grounding comes up everywhere. So the introduction of this concept into contemporary philosophy has had a big impact. Okay, so what is this idea? What's it for? What can we do with it? So one way of getting into the idea is to think about that there are features of reality that seem to explain other features of reality. And there's lots of different examples of this. So we might focus on truth, okay? We might take a proposition and say, why is it true? Well, it's true because of the way reality is. Reality isn't that way because the proposition's true. That proposition is true because reality is a certain way. And then we might take a totally different topic, the mind, okay? Why am I feeling certain sensations right now? Well, according to physicalists, at least, it's going to be because in virtue of my brain being in a certain configuration. Take completely different topics. Why is it true that either I'm sitting here or standing over there? Well, it's true because I'm sitting here. Okay, so that's kind of a logical issue. Take something completely different in metaphysics, the determinable-determinate relationship, okay? The relationship between a property like being red and a more specific property like being scarlet. You might say, here's a scarlet thing. Why is it red? Well, it's red because it's scarlet. It's not scarlet because it's red. It's like the scarletness of that thing is a more specific way of being red. There's red, but there's lots of different ways of being red. You might be scarlet, maroon, whatever, okay? So this kind of relationship between the scarlet and the red, this kind of relationship between the brain and the mind, this kind of relationship between P and P or Q, this kind of relationship between the facts and reality, these can all be thought about as grounding relationships. So we have this kind of non-causal explanation happening right through metaphysics. It's not causal because it's not like the facts cause the proposition to be true. It's not like my brain configuration causes me to have certain sensations. It's a kind of a constitutive relationship, okay? It's not about causation. It's about one thing being a certain way makes this other thing be a certain way. And that's what this concept of grounding is meant to help capture, okay? It's a concept which is meant to unify all these very disparate topics in metaphysics, in science, in the mind, in language. Okay, so where did this concept of grounding come from? Well, like most big new ideas in philosophy, it's not really new. There were philosophers back in the day, people like Husserl at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, who talked about kind of similar ideas. But really, in contemporary analytic philosophy, the concept of grounding was introduced by Kit Fine in his 2001 paper, The Question of Realism. And then it was picked up by other philosophers kind of working in the same kind of areas. Jonathan Schaffer's paper 2009 on What Grounds What. Gideon Rosen's paper from 2010, Metaphysical Dependence. And then again in another paper by Kit Fine, his Guide to Ground. And in 2012, there was a collection of papers called Metaphysical Grounding, Understanding the Structure of Reality, edited by Fabrice Correa and Benjamin Schneider, that I think really helps to set these ideas of grounding being a big thing within the contemporary philosophical community. Now, when you have a newish concept like this in philosophy, it opens up a whole bunch of questions like, what is grounding? Is there one thing that is grounding, or are there a whole bunch of different relations that we can call grounding? Is grounding a relation at all? Is grounding a kind of explanation, or does it just kind of track explanations? Is grounding itself a thing that provides explanations, or do explanations somehow track grounding relationships in the world? Some philosophers have argued that, this concept of grounding, it really doesn't make sense. We should just do without it. Others have argued there's just a whole bunch of different grounding-ish relationships. None of them really get to be called the grounding relation. So these kind of skeptical views, I think they're a bit too dismissive. I'm not totally sold on the idea of grounding, but I think it's really interesting. And when we have a new, philosophical tool in our toolkit, I think we should investigate it. We should see what it does for us. And, after a certain period of time, if it turns out, it's not that useful, we just drop it. No real harm done. But, I don't really like the idea that right at the start of the discussion we go, I don't see the point of this, let's just forget about it. One bunch of really good questions that this discussion about grounding opens up is, what are its logical features, right? Can we have circles of ground where this thing grounds this thing and this thing grounds this thing? Can we have infinite chains of ground where this is grounded in this, which is grounded in this, which is grounded in something below it, and on and on and on without end? Or must there be some kind of foundation which grounds everything else? So, I quite like to think that we want to base our metaphysics on our best available science. So we might say that there is a foundation for all of reality in the standard model of particle physics, and we kind of read our basic ground level metaphysics off of the standard model and the kind of properties that science says those particles have. And then we tell a story about how they make up the rest of reality. I just think that's a really interesting metaphysical project to get stuck into. This idea of making things up, as in building bits of reality from more basic bits, this is central to Karen Bennett's 2017 book, Making Things Up. It's this idea of construction, not like construction that we do, making things in time, but reality being constructed kind of in layers, the physical, the chemical, the biological, right up to the psychological, the social, all of it. I think that's just a really interesting way of thinking about reality. Okay, there's loads more that we could say here, but let's move on to our fourth topic. We're going to talk about philosophy of science. Now, philosophy of science is a big area because science is a big area, but in recent years, an awful lot of the interest in philosophy of science has been focused on physics. Philosophy of physics has become a huge area in contemporary philosophy. I think it's where some of the most interesting ideas live. And one of the big theories in philosophy of physics is the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics. Okay, this is going to be a tricky one to explain. Let me have a go. So quantum reality seems to be in some sense indeterministic, in that if we take a quantum system like an electron, it can have properties like spin. An electron could be spin up, spin down, but it seems like there's no way of telling in advance which property that electron is going to have until we measure it. When we measure it, there's a 50% chance that the electron will be spin up and a 50% chance that it's going to be spin down. And moreover, it doesn't seem that our inability to predict in advance which one it's going to be is a limitation of us or our theories. You might think that reality can't be genuinely indeterministic. Einstein, reflecting on quantum theory, said, no, God does not play dice. He posited there must be some hidden variables, stuff that we haven't found yet in quantum reality, that will enable us, if we theorize it properly, to predict whether, for instance, this electron is going to be spin up or spin down. But it turns out that kind of theory doesn't work. If there were hidden variables, we would get different observed phenomena than we actually do observe. There's a probabilistic argument that just shows hidden variable theories don't seem to work. So the indeterminacy in quantum theory seems to reflect a genuine indeterminacy in quantum reality. But, and here's kind of the problem, quantum theory is a deterministic theory in the sense that it's based on the Schrödinger wave equation, which tells us how systems, quantum systems, evolve in time deterministically. It's just that it doesn't tell us for sure whether the electron will be spin up or spin down. It just gives us the probabilities. We can calculate the probabilities of various properties of the location of the electron or whatever using the wave equation. So how are we going to square these things that in one sense the quantum theory is a deterministic theory with the kind of way that our measurements, our observed measurements, seem to suggest that reality, quantum reality, is indeterministic? So this is partly where interpretations of quantum mechanics come in. People have been giving these things since right back in the day of quantum mechanics back in the 1930s. So you have what are called collapse theories, like the Copenhagen interpretation. Okay, you've got the quantum system, it's in superposition, it's evolving through time, and then along we come, and that superposition collapses. The quantum wave collapses based on that measurement, and it collapses down to something that we can definitely measure. The electron is spin up, spin down, whatever. And these interpretations seem to get the data right, but they're very, very weird, both from a scientific and a philosophical view. They're weird from a scientific view because they are adding this concept of the measurement which collapses the superposition. There's kind of none of that in the quantum theory. In the proper scientific theory, you just have the Schrödinger equation. No mention of collapse, no mention of measurement or anything like that. They're philosophically weird because it's saying that something about us, our consciousness or our measuring instruments or whatever, comes along and changes the nature of that bit of reality from a quantum to a classical system. And it's kind of weird to think that our consciousness or our measuring equipment or whatever could do that. Now, if you were a classical idealist thinking really there's no facts about reality beyond kind of our thought, our thought makes reality the way it is, then you can square this, right? The Copenhagen interpretation makes good sense for idealists, but why should you have to be an idealist just to make sense of our best physics? So this is where the many worlds interpretation comes in. It says when you have a system in superposition, really there are kind of two bits of reality going on there. And when we make our measurement, nothing really changes except for those two bits of reality go their separate ways. So the many worlds of the many worlds interpretation are these two separate bits of reality that kind of were superposed together but go their separate ways when we measure. And maybe that's not the right way of putting it. We shouldn't think about it as our measurement causing them to go in separate ways. Rather, when we measure, when we observe the world, we can only observe one of those worlds, one of those realities. So it's like when we make the measurement, we are working out which of those bits of reality we are in. Are we in the spin up part of that reality or the spin down part of that reality? This is a big idea because the immediate implication is that there is more to reality than just the world we are in. Our universe, as it stretches in space and in time, that's not all of it, not even all of the physical reality. There are all these other quantum worlds. And basically, whenever systems interact, whether it's a measurement or just any kind of system interacting, we have this kind of splitting of reality. And given that this is happening all the time and it's been happening for a long time, that's going to mean that there is a lot to reality beyond the portion that we can experience. So, it's a super interesting idea. Okay, so where did this idea come from? It has a pretty interesting story. The idea comes from the physicist Hugh Everett in his 1957 Princeton PhD dissertation. He published his dissertation, it was pretty much ignored, nobody took this idea seriously, he basically couldn't even get a job in a physics department, I think he worked as a mathematician. Nobody really took this idea seriously as an interpretation of quantum mechanics. It was ignored for decades. In the 70s, the physicist Bryce DeWitt started kind of taking the idea seriously, and then much more recently, the Oxford physicist David Deutsch, he's written an awful lot supporting the theory, and then it started to move its way into philosophy. So the philosopher of physics, David Wallace, has a really nice 2012 book, The Emergent Multiverse. More recently, it's made its way into metaphysics, metaphysics. So Alistair Wilson has this really interesting 2020 book, The Nature of Contingency. So there, by contingency, he's thinking about modal notions like what could have been the case, what has to be the case. This idea in metaphysics that what could have been the case is what happens in some other possible world. What has to be the case, what's necessary, is what happens in all possible worlds. What are these possible worlds? Well, maybe they're just kind of figments of our imagination. Maybe they're abstract objects. One idea, and this is the idea that Al Wilson is talking about, is that the possible worlds of the metaphysician are the many worlds of the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics. So that is a super, super interesting way of integrating metaphysical ideas with ideas in physics. The physicist Max Tegmark, in his 2014 book, Our Mathematical Universe, talks about, over his career, how working physicists have changed their opinion on the many worlds interpretation. He kind of talks about doing informal surveys at conferences, like, which theory do you like? Which theory do you like? And back at the start of his career, I don't know, 40 years ago or whatever, people really weren't into the many worlds interpretation. But over the years, he's seen it growing popularity, and now he thinks it's one of the most popular interpretations of quantum physics amongst working physicists. So I think that's going to mean that it's going to increase in popularity in philosophy, in metaphysics, as well as in philosophy of physics. Hugh Everett, the guy who first proposed the theory, the story of his life is interesting but kind of sad. Apparently he believed in the reality of these many worlds, kind of just like the way that you or me believe in the reality of tables. He really, really fully subscribed to the theory, but nobody else believed in this theory and nobody took it seriously. And that seems to have led to real problems in his life. He's the father of the musician Mark Everett, E from Eels. There's this really interesting BBC documentary from 2007 called Parallel Worlds, Parallel Lives, in which Mark, the son, is going around talking to physicists about his father's theory, what they think about it. So if you can find that, definitely worth taking a look. Okay guys, so look, whenever anybody puts out a list of the top big ideas out there, it's going to be controversial, right? You're going to have different ideas of what should be on the list, what shouldn't be on the list. That theory's crazy, shouldn't be talking about that. Or maybe that was really interesting, I want to hear loads more about that. So if you felt there's something that I really should have talked about that wasn't here, let me know, maybe I can make a video about that. And if there was something here that you want me to talk about in more detail, like, that was interesting, I want to hear more about it, again, let me know and maybe we can make a video about that sometime in the future. For me, it's been really great thinking about all of these really diverse ideas from right across the spectrum of philosophy because, that's kind of what makes philosophy and thinking interesting, right? Don't kind of pigeonhole yourself in one area, think across the spectrum. I think that's the way to become a good philosopher. So I hope you've enjoyed this as much as I have. If you want to support the channel, you can buy me a coffee over on Ko-Fi. Thank you so much for watching this far. I really appreciate it. Thank you to all my Ko-Fi supporters for making this content possible, and I hope to see you guys back on Attic Philosophy soon.